Hey everyone, in this video we will try to understand how React memo works with a very basic example. So we have two components here, one is app and one is child component. App component has a state called count. Every time we click on a button, we increase the count by one. Now if you notice here, the child component does not receive any props, right? But if I try to click on a button, the component will re-render. So every time I'm clicking on a button, it's printing a new timestamp. Now, ideally, this should not be happening, and this is where the React memo comes into picture. If I wrap this component inside a memo function, now if I click on a button, the component won't re-render, the child component. What basically memo does is it takes two arguments. First is component, and second, if you hover on it, it takes a function called props are equal, and this returns a boolean. So if it returns true, that means the component should re-render, and if it returns false, that means the component should not re-render. For example, now every time we are clicking, the component is not re-rendering because the props are not changing since there is no prop only here. But if I add a custom function here, and let's say by default we are returning false, right? Now this will re-render every time. Now let's try to take another example. We'll remove this memo. Let's pass count as a prop now. Now, since the component receives a count as a prop, every time we change the count, it should re-render. Now, even if we wrap this inside memo, it shouldn't matter, right? Because the prop is anyways changing. So the component will re-render again. Now, this is with primitive data type. So if the count is changing, the prop is changing, and the component re-renders. Let's try to change the data type to non-primitive. Let's make a object called name, which has first name and last name. And on this function, what we'll do is we'll change the name, right? Now, if you see, just to understand this, we'll keep the initial values also same as the updated ones. So in case of primitive data type, basically what this React memo does is it performs a shallow comparison when we do not pass the custom function here. And by shallow comparison, what I mean is if the prop is primitive data type, it will compare previous prop with the next prop by its value. But if it is non-primitive data type, in this case it's an object, so it won't compare it by its value, it will compare it by its reference. And every time we do set name, even though the values are same, its reference changes, and the reason its reference changes, the component will also re-render. So let's try to do that, right? So even if the values are same on every click, the component is re-rendering. One way to prevent this component from re-rendering, even when the names are same as the initial names, is to use memo hook. What basically we are doing here is we are returning a name. Memo is name, so we are using first name and last name as dependencies. If first name and last name do not change, we get the memo as name. So if we pass this as a prop now, no matter how many times you click on it, the component won't re-render. But if I change this to John 1 and click, then only once it will re-render, right? Now, although this is very good way to prevent re-rendering of a component, we have to be very careful when we should use it and when we should not. For example, in this case, using memo was not really necessary. Why? Because we know whenever we are changing name, this whole component is going to re-render, and since we are using same name as a prop in the child component, which clearly means that we want the child component to re-render. So in this case, using memo is not necessary. But if you have some custom conditions you want to apply to prevent re-rendering, for example, if you want your component to re-render only when the first name changes, so you do not care about the last name, then what you can do is it takes two arguments, previous prop and next prop, right? So basically, if previous prop first name is not equal to next prop first name, and if you remember, this function is props are equal. So here props are, we are comparing props are not equal, so this should return false. Means if last first name and the next first name is not same, then only the component should re-render. Otherwise, it should not, right? So if I click on this, nothing happens because previous first name and the next first name is same. But if I change this to 1, now this will re-render. Now, if you change anything in the last name, it won't re-render because the custom condition is only caring about the first name, right? So if I change this to this, it won't re-render.